One thing that I'm really proud of, and I'd like to say to you in front of a camera, maybe it's the only thing I'm really proud of in my life, is that all these conductors were my friends.
When he showed an early interest in music, his father discouraged him. When asked about this later, his father said, "How could I know he'd turn out to be Leonard Bernstein?" Conductor of major orchestras, composer of Broadway musicals and symphonies, lecturer, teacher, pianist, shameless romantic, and Renaissance man of the musical theater. And it is his gift for making music accessible to all of us that has lodged him in our hearts forever.
In the spring of that first season at Curtis, I read in the paper that Koussevitzky was opening a school called Tanglewood at the Berkshire Music Center, and applications would be considered. So I armed myself with these letters from Roy Harris, Aaron Copland, William Schur, you know, the same old the 3 letters. And I went to Boston and had an interview with Koussevitzky. And that's when I first met him. It was in the green room of Symphony Hall. It was so grand, and I was so shaking. And he said, "Oh, you study with Fritz Reiner. Very interesting." Then he read the letters, and he said, "You know Aaron?" And, wonderful, wonderful. I said by mistake, wonderful, I agreed. Which I thought would eliminate me forever, but didn't register. He suddenly said, "But of course I accept you in my class." I didn't have to play the piano, do anything. Just on the basis of letters and, I don't know, personal, because we obviously loved each other on sight. Mm-hmm. And so it was. He became my father instantly. And so I went to Tanglewood that summer of 1940, and every week the student-conducted class had to play something with the student orchestra. It was a regular weekly thing. And I had just arrived there. This is the first week. And my assignment turned out to be the Randall Thompson Second Symphony. All of it, not just a movement. Usually you had a movement of something because there's so many people in the class. No, the whole Second Symphony, because of course he is your teacher in Curtis, and he was sort of favoring that piece at the moment. So that was the first piece I ever conducted under Koussevitzky's aegis at Tanglewood. And it took a lot of doing. I'd never conducted an orchestra anywhere before. When this was before a public, and you rehearsed and came to concert and so on. It was the first time I ever did such a thing, and it was in the first week. And Randall was there, and it wasn't easy. And I remember particularly when we got to the scherzo, which was in 7/4 time, and it's a little tricky. It's not really, but then it seemed tricky in those days. That was, after all, 41 years ago. And I remember sitting in bushes, hiding in bushes, studying the score all day so I wouldn't be disturbed by friends or people walking by, learning this piece with all my might, and then coming to rehearse it with Koussevitzky sitting there because he was the conducting teacher. And he'd observe the rehearsal, then we'd have a private session. Everyone in the class did. But it was obvious from the beginning that we were the relationship. We loved each other. And till the day he died in my arms. That was an incredible relationship. In 51, so we had 11 years.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a lovely touch that later on you recorded that symphony with the Philharmonic.
I love it still.
Wonderful
But
piece.
it was a huge thing to do for your first
think.
student concert. Everybody else had something like the second movement of the New World Symphony or the finale of something or other, Seventh Beethoven. But I had the whole Randall Thompson. And when it came to the scherzo, which was in 7, because he was sitting there in this great cape, you know, on the stage of the shed, and I was trying to get them through to teach them bum ba da 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 da. The whole thing is in that. It's just it doesn't change.
Well,
But
that's a help.
once you learn 1-7-4 bar, you've learned them all. But in trying to teach them that pattern, I remember Kusvitsky getting up and saying, "No, Kinder, you see, what Lenishko tried to tell you is Yataheim, Taheim, Tahai, Dam, Dam," missing the whole point of the syncopation.
Yes.
You understand it is 3 plus 4. Yam, Taheim, Taheim, Tahai, Da, Dam. And it's not Tahai, Dam, Dam at all. It's Dam, Da, Da, Da. I didn't say anything. It made it very much harder for me to teach them the syncopation,
Of
which was the
course.
whole point of the little jazzy thing in the scherzo. But I got over that. That was one thing because he couldn't teach me. I could teach him about jazz.
American syncopation.
And years later when, not so many years later, 8 years later, when he conducted the premiere of My Age of Anxiety and I was at the piano, he had terrible trouble with the jazz movement, the mask. He couldn't beat it, and I had to have special sessions with him at the piano and show him. I was again teaching him, see, about that. And he said, "Leonard, it is very difficult. You know why? It is not symphonical music. It is a jazz. It is not for a symphony. Why you not write different scherzo? Make different scherzo." I said, "It's too late. This is the piece." And it's all bound up with the rest. And I said, "It's just, you know, it's not really hard. If it's just, we went through for hours, and he finally got it, and he said, 'You know, Levishka, it is a jazz, but it is a noble jazz.'" And that, for some reason, he
saved
had
it.
convinced himself that he could now conduct it.
Yes.
Because it was noble.
With dignity.
You know. So he went through yabba dabba da, toot, 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 as though he were conducting God knows what of Beethoven, Mrs. Celebrity. And it was quite wonderful. And thus the premiere of Age of Anxiety happened. Now going back, I was his student for a summer I shall never forget. I mean, the first summer with Kusvitsky, the first summer of tango.
Tanglewood.
Then I went back to Reiner for a second year in Philadelphia, because it was a 2-year course. Got my diploma. I studied there with Renée Longy, score reading, great lady. Randall Thompson, orchestration. Except we spent most of our time doing London Times crossword puzzles, because it turned out we were both fanatics about that. And he kept millions of them in his bottom desk drawer. And I would come in with my orchestration exercise. He'd look at it and say, "Great, okay." And out would come the puzzle, and we'd sit and do that for an hour. And just have the best time. We got to be very good friends. And Reiner and I got to be very good friends, strangely enough.
That's something special.
Really something. I mean, not good friends that we went out and had a drink together or nothing like that. But enough so that a certain other member of the class, the boy from Hartford, Connecticut, bought a gun and ammunition with every intention of shooting Reiner and me. And the only way he just went ape. He went out of his mind because he thought Reiner favored me and disfavored him. And Walter Handel went through the same thing, by the way. He almost died of a nervous breakdown because it was so difficult what Reiner asked us to do and to know. Well, this boy from Hartford, whose name I won't mention because he's around and he teaches, being crazy, made the crazy mistake of announcing his plan to Randall Thompson. He said, I'm going to do this. I want you to know I'm going to do this today. And he showed the gun and the bullets which he had bought. And I came in for my orchestration class that morning, and Randall stuck me in the bathroom and said, lock the door and don't come out till I tell you. What? Because he had been in before.
Yes.
And I was sitting there just in Randall's bathroom for 1 hour without knowing why. I don't think I've ever told this story to anybody.
I've never heard it.
Anyway, he finally said, okay, you can come out now. He's gone. I said, who's gone? He's taken care of. Apparently, the police ambulance had come and taken him to Hartford. Everything was saved, including Reiner's life, my life, and Randall's life. Because he said, then I'm going to shoot you after I get them, because the whole school is corrupted. It's all about Leonard Bernstein. So they managed to get him to a hospital and into care. And today he's teaching at university. I won't even tell you which. It was like that with Reiner. Some people cracked. And there were people who quit. Lucas Foss was in the class. He was marvelous. Walter Handel, Max Goberman.
Oh, yes.
Oh, we had a wonderful. Ezra Rochlin. Where is he now? Is he in Texas?
He was in
somewhere?
Fort Worth, but he's left. He went to London, and I don't think he's there now. I'm not sure.
I haven't heard his name.
He married a wealthy woman.
Ah, that's a good
He
solution.
doesn't have to work.
We had a pretty wonderful class, Walter Handel. But I had a drink one day with Walter when the day was done, and he was crying. He said, I don't know what to do. I can't stand it. And I said, I know, I can't stand it either, but you just have to do it. You have to suffer this man's standards, because that's what we're learning. He gave us the Ninth Symphony to learn, for example. The finale. Because, he was very crazy about recitatives. And we started with Carmen recitativi, Don Giovanni recitativi, era quanto avanzata la notte, quando nella mia stanza. We had to do that, we had to do Carmen, we had to do all kinds of recitativi, and then finally the great recitative of Beethoven. Oh, Frau, and we had to learn the whole thing. And when we came in, when the famous tune begins, and the variations of it, there's one with the great bassoon obbligato, as you know. And he stopped everyone in the class and he said, what's the bassoon playing? I want to hear the whole obbligato. And that's when Walter cracked. He said, how can he expect us to know that? It's hard. I thought it was just about the recitatives, but we have to know that too. Yeah, we have to know that. You have to know that too. And it was a very melodramatic year.
It sounds good.
Anyway, we skip. I go back next summer, the second summer with Kusevitsky, 41. Fabulous summer. And now I am with a diploma from 2 schools, Curtis. Oh, did I mention Isabella Vengerova, my piano teacher?
I was going to ask
Curtis,
about
one
her.
of the
She was in
greatest-
Philadelphia.
Oh,
Yeah.
she was at Curtis. I knew I left out the most important thing. What a lady.
You worked with her while you were working with Reiner, I mean,
Yeah.
at Curtis, yes.
Because the committee that had to pass on who would study with Serkin did not admit me. And she was on that committee, and she said, I'll take it. The other people on the committee said, you can't, your schedule is filled. She said, I'll take him anyway. I learned all this years later. I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, sure.
They wouldn't let me study with Serkin because, why, I don't know. They're those ladies, Mrs. Braun, and the friends of Madame Bach.
Bach, yeah.
Anyway, I'm very happy I studied with Vengerova. She raised hell with me, and she made me listen to what I was doing at the piano, which nobody ever made me do. She said, you wouldn't dream of letting your orchestra play the way you just played. Do you realize what you just did? If that were an orchestra, you would stop immediately and correct it, banging the left hand like that and not letting the inner line come out. How dare you? Who do you think you are? You have to listen when you play. She was a tyrant, and she taught me to listen.
Did you
And
study
that
Mozart
affected me
concertos
as a
with her?
conductor.
Yes, of course.
I didn't study Mozart with her. I studied Beethoven sonatas, Scriabin sonatas, I don't know, Schumann sonata, F-sharp minor sonata. So the first year was hell with her. I was so shaking and frightened every time I'd come for a lesson that I could barely play. And the second year I realized that she was a great lady and that she loved me enough to be tyrannical and make it serious. That she wasn't just being brutal, she was taking it seriously. And then we became very, very close and loving friends. She's one of the great people in my life. I mourn.
Were there European conductors, not, for instance, counting Metropolis, Koussevitzky, and Reiner, but I mean European conductors who stayed in Europe who also had an effect on you or some influence?
Well, you asked about those who influenced
Yes.
me most. So, all right, now those are my teaching conductors, so to speak, of my student days. And once I became a conductor, the assistant conductor of the Philharmonic, I was 25. It wasn't until then that I met Toscanini. Because Toscanini, whom I had adored, but only in certain works, on the radio, but I never met him, because he and Koussevitzky hated each other. And I was sure he'd never want to meet me anyway, because I was a Koussevitzky disciple, and he was sure I'd never want to meet him because he was Koussevitzky's great opponent.
Was it purely
and
a rivalry?
He used to listen to my broadcasts, it turned out. As I had listened to his for years, but I was a newcomer. He had heard me on the radio, and he'd asked somebody to bring me out. So finally, he was very old by this time, bring me out for a New Year's afternoon thing. New Year's, he always had people in. And I came trembling. Horowitz was there, and the whole crowd. And we loved each other. We became very close friends. And he was too old. I mean, there was no time to make a relationship anymore. But what I do remember, I don't think I've ever told this either. In the course of that year that followed that New Year's meeting, and every concert I heard of his since I'd met him was bad. For some reason, he forgot. And he was chastising himself, and backstage he would scream and groan, stupido, Toscanini, bad, boom. And the more he did that, the more I loved him, because the humility of it is so moving. And it's a thing you don't find very often. And of all people, Toscanini, the synonym of conductor was Toscanini in those days, right? Still is, I guess.
Absolutely.
Well, when this man and I got to know each other, I had to find reasons to see him. And he had to find reasons to see me, because we loved each other, but there was no real occasion. And there was always that Koussevitzky thing in the way. He was never quite sure that I really admired him.
Well, was that purely a rivalry? Well, I mean, was it an intense professional jealousy just between the two men, or was it a matter perhaps of public recognition and the degrees of each, the way in which each man got more or less recognition from the public?
Anything
both.
else? I don't know.
Yeah,
Yes, sure.
I mean, Koussevitzky used to say, oh, Toscanini, he is very good conductor for opera. For opera, very good.
And what did
Why he
Toscanini
conduct
say?
Beethoven? Why he bother?
Really?
Then Toscanini used to sort of spit and go, Koussevitzky. Doesn't know the score. if he no look in the score, he no know what to play. Something like that. You know.
All right.
He no know what to 3, 4.
Yes, but they were both incredible.
Incredible. Just imagining this horrible rivalry.
Yes.
It's very hard to be friends with both. But I was friends with almost every conductor then, and that was quite a source of pride for me. George Zell was my dear friend. Not many people can say George Zell was a dear friend.
He was a great friend. Though,
We
he was a
played
friend.
four-hand music and cried together, and Schubert and Mozart. And we discovered each other in Chicago, Ravinia, one summer when I was conducting, and he was there, and we were in somebody's house. We played four hands, and we realized we were in the presence of
Yes, yeah.
each other,
Yeah.
and that lasted. I was there when he died too.
No, really.
I went to Cleveland. I didn't see him. They wouldn't let me in the room. I was there when Stravinsky died. That's another story. Anyway, I was about to conduct excerpts from Romeo and Juliet of Berlioz. And so I was listening to people's records. In those days, I used to listen to records and see how other people did it. And I was studying the score for the first time. And I made up some reasons to ask Toscanini about certain tempi he'd taken that didn't seem to be Berlioz metronome marks, and it was just an excuse to go see him. I called him, appointment was made, I went out to Riverdale, very exciting. I was going to see Toscanini again. And I went there, we spent hours and hours together. It was just amazing, even before we got to the point of Romeo and Juliet. But finally we did, because there had to be a justification for my being there. And so I said, it says dotted quarter equals 60, and it seems to me that you do it much faster. An idiot question, you know, who cares about metronome marks?
Sure.
And she said, I always make what Berlioz said I make. He knew metronoma. Sounds like a variety of cancer. Metronoma. He said, I have to get my score. So with the 83-year-old man or something like that, with the agility of a puma, begins dashing up these staircases, 3 flights to the attic where he had all his scores, and I'm with my asthma trying to follow him, barely keeping up with this ancient man. I was a young kid. And I arrived huffing and puffing, and he was up there looking through his scores, and he found it. And he said, it's true, it says 60. And, where's my record? And oh, it's in the cellar.
Oh.
So, and I don't know where it is, because it was an RCA broadcast or something, an NBC broadcast. So, no, it must have been a public record, otherwise how would I have heard it?
He recorded it.
Yeah, but he couldn't find it. Anyway, he said, look, I'll look for it. It's in the cellar. My records are all in the cellar, and I have to look and find it, but I'll let you know, right? It was very late by then. There was no way of going through the cellar and finding the record. So we talked about a million other things, and finally went home. I got home very late, and I put on this record to verify my complaint, and it was not faster. It was Munch's record that was faster, much faster, and I'd mixed up the two. So I immediately sat down and wrote a letter. Dear Maestro Toscanini, I have made a terrible mistake. It is not, I mailed it and posted it that night, at 1 o'clock in the morning, whatever it was. Forgive me, I wish I were dead. I made a terrible mistake. This crossed with a letter from him that he had written the same night, because he had gone down to the cellar, right, saying, Caro Bernstein, stupido Toscanini, of course you were right. My tempo was all wrong. It has nothing to do with Berlioz. I am a stupid old man. I make stupid mistakes. This crossed with my letter saying, it was, no, it's not. I tell you, it was the mix-up of all time. And there was no way of straightening it out. You know, it got to that point of complexity. I couldn't call up and say, I got your letter, but
Don't read mine.
Don't read mine, or vice versa. There was no way, so it just all settled that way. He apologized to me, I apologized to him, and to this day, I don't know who was right or wrong. All I know is that we had the most wonderful day together. And then he got very sick after that. Then he did that famous concert where he forgot the end of Meistersinger, and that was that. It was the end, and he wasn't seeable anymore. So that was the next influence. Then, what can I say? The next really great influence. Well, Zell.
Yes.
Then, of course, I was assistant to Rodzinski, who had a tremendous flair for conducting, really remarkable coloristic sense, but was not a great musician, and was also quite mad and paranoid and tried to kill me, and that's a whole other story. I won't even bother
Terribly
telling
difficult man.
you. Because I was his assistant, and my name was in the paper every day, and his wasn't. It was a horrible story. He suffered.
Yeah.
It was his first season at the Philharmonic, and I was his assistant. Imagine. And Virgil was coming out with unbearable reviews about, with the possible exception of Beecham, Bernstein has the greatest command of rhythmic understanding, and I don't know what he was writing. And this man had to get up and read these things.
The Beecham parallel is one I happen to love because I knew Sir Thomas very well.
So that.
And I think it was
We
marvelous.
shared a dressing room in those years
Yeah.
at the Ballet Theatre.
Yeah.
He was conducting the Romeo and Juliet Delius music that Tudor had put together, and I was conducting Fancy Free. And they usually occurred on the same program, so we'd share the same dressing room.
And the two of you would conduct on the same program.
That's how I made
Ballet.
money. That's how I made my living, was conducting Fancy Free. Otherwise, one thing that I'm really proud of, and I would like to say to you in front of a camera, maybe it's the only thing I'm really proud of in my life, is that all these conductors were my friends. All these conductors who hated one another, who hated any other conductor. Monteux was my dearest friend. It started very badly on shipboard. We found ourselves on the same boat crossing the Atlantic, and we were invited to sit at the captain's table, and Doris Monteux was there, and nobody would talk to me. And finally, I turned to Doris Monteux one night, and I said, "What have I done?" And she told me some kind of incredible story that she had heard that so-and-so said, da-da-da-da. And finally, we cleared that up, and it was all a bunch of usual lies and somebody trying to make trouble. And the rest of the voyage, we became very, very close friends.
Good.
And Pierre Monteux and I would sit on shipboard screaming Carmen together, and every French opera in the book, Faust, and having the best time. And Ravel Scheherazade, and he'd take one part and I'd take the other, and he'd take the vocal part and I'd be the cello, and he'd be the cello. I don't know, we just had such a good time together. What a wonderful man.
Marvelous.
Bruno Walter was my closest friend. We had Mahler in common. I'd never even done Mahler. But of course, he was the one who got sick when I made that crazy
For which we always have to be
coast-to-coast date,
thankful.
you know.
Yeah.
And the first time I ever met him was that day when I went to his hotel room, and he was wrapped up in blankets, and he showed me a few things in Don Quixote, which I had to conduct that afternoon. And he was so kind and old and authentic.
Yes.
And he had a lot to do with my having been able to get through that program that day with no rehearsal, and being 25 years old and never having given a public concert in my life. And it was on the radio, coast to coast, and and the next morning I was on the front page of the New York Times. And he had more than a little to do with that. And then, of course, after that, we became friends. But again, he was too old. It was like with Toscanini. There wasn't enough time left to make a relationship. But Zell, Brunewald, Monteux, Munch. Munch was exactly the opposite kind of conductor from me.
Yes.
Also, he succeeded Kusevitsky, which already put him on my shit list.
Sure.
Right? Because who was going to succeed? Who could succeed this man? And he was what Kusevitsky referred to as this frivolous Frenchman. Now, of course, what Kusevitsky had wanted was for me to succeed him, but I kept saying, no, I don't want an orchestra. He couldn't understand that. He said, they will offer you, you will take. I said, they will offer me, I won't take. I want to write music. I was writing a Broadway show. I was writing a book. I can't be enslaved to an orchestra. I will conduct it here and there. They will offer you, you will take. And then what broke his heart is they didn't offer. Mm-hmm. And they took instead this frivolous Frenchman. So the frivolous Frenchman came to Boston, and in spite of everything, we became dear friends. And you know how?
No.
He called me up one day, and he said, I was just driving in my car, and I had the radio on, and I heard the Missa Solemnis as I have never heard it in my life. And at the end, they said, that was you and the Philharmonic, and that's that old record with Eileen Farrell. And he said, all my life, I have prayed that I could do the Missa Solemnis the way I just heard it today in my car. I had to call you. Talk about humility.
He was a truly generous man. Yes. That's
I couldn't believe it. I was still
lovely.
a kid. I mean, I was half his age. I was 30-something, he was 60-something. Well, those things just killed me. Mm-hmm. We were very close, but I can't say that his conducting influenced me, if that's what you're asking. I don't know what.
No, I was just curious about
asking
the other
about
things you said. Yeah, the
relationships.
conductors. You know.
Well, De Sabata I was very close to. I can't think of a conductor I was not close to.
There was a great era of conductors too.
Oh, De Sabata, that old recording of Tosca with Callas, there is still
One of the greatest
nothing
things.
that can ever top it. Nothing.
No, that's right. One of the great achievements.
And
He
I
was
was
in
lucky
Pittsburgh
enough
for a
to
while,
be
wasn't he?
able to work with Callas myself.
Oh, I know. You conducted at La Scala
Anyway,
with Hermedin.
yes, he was in Pittsburgh for a while, and they were crazy about him. He was going to take the orchestra, and he got sick.
Yes.
And he had love problems, and Valentina, and that. I shouldn't be saying this. I didn't say that. Anyway, wonderful man, really wonderful man.
Now, how much of this time?
Now, wait a minute.
Question
One
mark.
of the greatest influences, and I've got to tell you this story,
Yes.
because this is a story among stories, was Furtwängler. Now, obviously, I couldn't have known Furtwängler because it was the whole Nazi period. I was not in Europe. There were some records of his around, not many, but I had heard enough to know that this was, way beyond.
All by itself.
All by itself. And I thought someday maybe I'll hear him. And everybody kept saying he was a Nazi and forget it. And he was in Germany through the whole thing. He didn't leave. He wasn't Jewish. There was no reason for him to leave. But he saved many Jews.
He did.
And he fought against the whole thing that Karajan went with.
Of course.
And Karajan was very much interested in his own career. He was a kid then, ambitious.
But Furtwängler saved the
And
lives of
his-
men in his orchestra.
Oh, don't I know it?
And more,
Please.
yeah.
Since I've been going to Vienna and Germany all these years, I know all the stories.
Yes.
Böhm, who was a bigger Nazi than Karajan, was my dearest friend. The old bastard, I love him. Now,
At this point, when they're that
Furtwängler, I
old, you
never
get into a
met,
problem. Yeah.
and this is the story. That I was conducting in Holland in the late 40s, so a couple of years after the war ended. Feelings were still pretty hot. And I used to go every summer to conduct the Residentie Orchestra in Scheveningen, which was the beach port of The Hague,
Yes.
where everybody went to the courthouse to swim and eat lobster and Nieuwe Haring.
Gorgeous, yeah.
You know, dipped in onions. And I fell in love with this place. And I went every June conducted in this old courthouse, which had a great, huge hall, old oak, dark thing. And this was the Hague Orchestra, not the Concertgebouw.
No.
And one of the summers, I was asked to bring the concert, I guess it's 48 by now, 48, 49, something like that, to bring the concert to Amsterdam and play it in the Concertgebouw. I think it was a special thing. It was like a Mahler symphony. And Mahler was always very big in Holland because of Mengelberg, who was his champion.
Yes.
And I think it was the Mahler's second, too. And we were all invited, kit and caboodle, chorus, everything, back off stage brass, to come to do it in Amsterdam after our performance in Scheveningen. And we did. And I noticed on the poster outside the Concertgebouw said Furtwängler conducting Brahms first and something else. Right? And I said, I've got to go to that tonight. It was the night before my concert. And there was a picket line around the house because they felt very strongly.
Dutch picketing, Furtwängler.
Dutch,
Yes,
Dutch,
yes,
not
sure.
Jews.
No,
Dutch,
no, yeah.
because they felt very strongly about it, as I don't have to tell you. And it was all a whole, it was Anne Frank in spades, you know, and these Dutchmen walking around with these posters, no Nazi conductors, blah, 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 keep the Nazis out. And I said, we had the same agent, who was a man called G. de Koos, K-O-O-S, and he was known by his initial G, which is pronounced G in Dutch. So I said, G, I've got to hear this man. He said, well, you can't walk through a picket line, especially you.
No, no.
And being Jewish. And also, your presence there will just cause a terrible commotion. Now, I'll tell you what, I can get you into a stage box through the backstage where you won't be seen. There are those boxes that are right on the stage, you know, for the directors and so on. And you can watch there, which he did. And I watched Brahms first. I watched this man conduct Brahms first. I've never seen anything like it, never heard anything like it. He was conducting the Concertgebouw Orchestra, not mine. I don't know how they knew where to play, where the beat was. They did, and in an extraordinary way. I've never heard Brahms first like that. I was in tears, and I said to G, I've got to go back and just kneel to this man or touch him, or, to say that I've met him, to be able to tell my grandchildren that I. He said, you can't do that. The press will be there. It'll be all over Europe, and it'll be embarrassing for him. Embarrassing for you. The Dutch will make a big deal out of it. You can't meet him. So, all right, I had to accept that. The next night I conducted this, whatever, and I found out only later that he had done exactly the same thing and was in that stage box. But I found out years later.
No.
And that he had asked G. de Koos, could he come backstage to meet me? And he said, no, the press, the same story. And we were not allowed to shake hands with each other on 2 successive nights because of public opinion. Now, when he died, which was 5 years later or something, early 50s, 54, whatever it was, his secretary sent me a page of his diary, of his journals, a copy, saying, I thought you might be interested to read this page. It was dated something 48, June. It said, tonight I heard the greatest conductor in the world, and I was prevented from meeting him. This I found out only in the 50s, after he died.
Yeah.
The greatest conductor in the world. I mean, nobody's the greatest conductor in the world. I don't care who he is.
No.
But that he cared that much.
Yes, yes.
Furtwängler. Anyway, you ask about influences. That's the next. I could go on. The latest. Well, I mean, shall I tell you about Böhm, who's the furthest, even further from my kind of conducting than Munch, let's say.
Yes.
I mean, he's a man who conducts like this. And when he does that, it's the climax.
Huge, yes.
When I was in Munich making the first act of Tristan in January, he was doing Entführung, 87 years old.
Yes, incredible.
And I thought, when will I ever hear this man again? So I went to the opera house to hear Entführung. Again, stage box. And it took him 5 minutes to get to his pult in the pit. That's how slowly he walks, shaking.
Yes.
He won't let anybody help him. He staggered somehow to it, got up there. The cast was going mad. Nobody could follow him. The orchestra, they followed the concertmaster,
Yeah.
Marty Tavel, who was singing.
Yes,
Also, in
Osman.
the intermission, he said, we don't know what to do. I mean, we love this man, but we
Yeah,
can't follow
no,
him.
no,
He
no.
just doesn't show us anything. He's so old and he shakes, and we don't know if it's a beat or
Of
not, or
course.
whether he's just shaking. So I went back to see him, the intermission, because there is a certain something that's wonderful, in spite of all that.
Oh, yes.
Even with all that, and they're not together,
No, it's still
but
good.
there's an echt Mozart grace. There's something he, just by being there, he brings to Entführung that nobody else could do with Entführung, with a piece like that. And it was really wonderful to hear. So I went backstage to say so. I said, oh, Leonard Bernstein, I hear you do Tristan now in Munich. One act. You have so many rehearsals. I know everything, I found out. You have so many rehearsals for one act, more than I ever had for the whole opera. You know, he possesses this opera. He's very,
it's his,
very
he thinks. Yes,
possessive
yes,
of Tristan. He
yes.
wrote it. He does.
Yes, he sings all the roles.
Right. And he said, you know, I made Tristan 9 times last year, and Vienna 7 times in the Bayreuth, Orange. I never had more than 2 rehearsals. I hear you have, I don't know how many, I had actually 36 hours of rehearsal for one act. That counts piano rehearsals, orchestra, everything, chorus. But still, it's 36
All
hours.
right. It's a big act, too.
But anyway, Böhm said, well, you never conducted before, Tristan. I know. Well, I've conducted excerpts. I've never done the whole opera. You never conduct Wagner? No. I don't know from Wagner. I don't know about this cult. I've never been to Bayreuth. I've never conducted a Wagner opera. I was a very late comer to Wagner, although I knew the obvious things when I was a kid. You know, I played the Ride of the Valkyries on the piano when I was 11, and Elsa's Dream and all that. But no. He said, well, maybe. He was very herablassend, as they say in Austria.
Yes,
he was
he's
very
very
condescending. He said,
yes.
maybe you get away with it. With so many rehearsals, one act only, you'll get away. He said, of course you understand, I can't come to a performance because you're my dear old friend, but I can't come to a performance. I will make only disturbance. Everybody will ask for my autograph, and they will, you know, I know it's on television, you don't want any disturbances. It's 87 years.
Yes.
And he knows he'll never conduct Tristan again. He can barely get through Entführung, you know. Ariadne, out. And he'll never conduct any of those again. He's so feeble. So he said, maybe you understand if I just come to a rehearsal and 20 minutes only because I get so tired. But I would like to hear, I'm interested to hear Behrens sing Isolde. He didn't say he was interested to hear me conduct Behrens sing Isolde. And maybe you do so many rehearsals. Good luck, you know, herablassend. Fine, I'll do my best. I'm very worried about it too.
Awesome, fine, Brecken.
Anyway, I said, look, you come to rehearsal, put the red carpet, we'll have trumpeters, just tell when you... He didn't tell. He just came, and I wasn't aware of it. And it wasn't even a very good rehearsal. It was the first time I tried to run the whole thing without a stop. And that's always, you know, sort of messy, hard. And that was the morning, and there was a lunch period, and we were going to do the same thing again in the afternoon. Second run through. And at the end of this morning thing, I was sitting there sort of in the doldrums, and I was sitting alone at the podium trying to think where we went wrong and where I could do better. And I see this man bounding down like a young goat from the aisle, and came up to the stage, to the podium, and it was Karl Böhm. Eyes ablaze, cheeks aflame, a young man. And he had been there indeed for the whole rehearsal. No 20 minutes, 93 and a half minutes it takes me for the first act. And he said, Leonard Bernstein, endlich habe ich zum ersten Mal Tristan gehört in meinem Leben. That's full wrong word order. He said,
I will translate.
He said, zum ersten Mal in meinem Leben habe ich Tristan endlich gehört.
Finally, Bernstein, for the first time in my life, I am hearing Tristan.
And I fell right down.
The man who thought he owned it.
And I was sort of kneeling on the podium because this man was way down there, and I was in this awful position toward this great dying maestro. I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. Paralyzed. All I could think of was that before the rehearsal, John McClure, my sound man, had said to me, please, Lenny, isn't there something you can do about the prelude? We're dying there in the control room. It's so slow. It's 15 minutes you take for the prelude. Böhm does it in 10. Now, you know, between 10 and 15 is a pretty...
You shouldn't.
And I said, look, you do your job and I'll do my job. I do it slow. I do what I think Wagner wrote. So all I could think to say to Böhm was, this was in my head from John McClure, was auch das Vorspiel, also the prelude. You mean you even like the prelude? He said, überhaupt das Vorspiel.
We Europeans don't dare to play Wagner the way Wagner wrote it.
It's an incredible thing to hear from this man. Not Scholti, not Karajan, not Kleiber, not me.
Imagine.
Because we're afraid of boring the audience. Langweilig. Das Publikum zu langweiligen. And so we make it go and we keep it together and keep it moving. And I realize now that that's why we bore the audience. That's the most boring thing in the world. Because, and that I must say, I heard Jimmy Levine do at the Met in that tradition, and I had to run after the first act. I couldn't stay in the place, and I love Jimmy. He's my disciple and my baby, and he learned to my knee. I couldn't sit in that hall, because he learned just this. Get rid of it as fast as possible, not to bore the public, and there's no firmer guarantee of boring the public than that.
You know, the
Don't make one event, you don't make one thing come true, come clear, because you're too busy going on to the next.
You know, the marking in the Mottl edition of the Tristan Prelude constantly says, nicht eilen, don't hurry. But that's largely ignored.
Well, start with the prelude. Langsam und schmachtend. Slow and longing, yearning. Schmacht.
My shoulders come
Now,
up.
he writes,
which should take forever.
And that chord, and then there are 8 rests, 8 beats of rest at this tempo.
And you wait.
No one I've ever heard just do them wait that long. No one. I do. And the audience thinks I've died. Literally, they get very nervous and there's kind of squirming, or they think I've forgotten what the next phrase is, or something was supposed to happen that didn't happen.
You know, you and John McClure had a marvelous predecessor. There was the time when Carl Muck was the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and he was recording the Prelude to Parsifal. And of course, these were the days of 78 RPMs. And his engineer, just like John McClure, asked you, Mr. Muck, couldn't you make that go a little faster, or at least don't take so long in the rests? And Muck said, but Wagner wrote the rests like that.
Then you do the second phrase, and the audience, you hear a sigh of relief, actually. When I finally got to do it, you could hear the audience say, oh, thank God he didn't die. And you do the second phrase, and then there's another long pause, not quite so long as the first. And they begin to get the idea. And by the third phrase, you've got them in this other time warp place, I mean, this other planet, or you haven't. If you haven't, then don't do the rest of the opera. Forget it.
Now I have a question.
You see what I mean?
Yes. Isn't there a direct relationship between that and the end of the first act of Tristan after they have drunk the love potion, and then there are the same notes and the same chords and the same rests at that point as they stand there facing each other without moving that you set up in the prelude?
Somebody timed the length of that chord, the chord,
The chord, the Tristan
chord,
chord.
when they drink.
Yes.
And they do.
Yeah.
So whole orchestra, then everybody drops out except the winds, the four winds. Now somebody timed that. On my performance, it was 25 seconds. In which an oboe player has to blow all his might and diminish, and then hold it, pianissimo, and then diminish on the rest of the phrase.
I want to ask you,
It's almost
historically,
impossible.
historically, isn't there an extra consideration in the fact that this chord in the prelude, it's the first chord in the prelude,
Right?
has never before in the history of music been heard in that way.
It's never been heard in that way, in that context.
Exactly.
But it's
exactly.
all through Beethoven.
Oh, it's been there, sure.
You find it everywhere.
But not this way. There isn't any name for that. They don't know what to call that chord.
We do.
It should
finally.
last.
I know what to call it.
What do you call it?
But everybody argues. Everybody thinks he has his way of calling
What do
it.
you call it?
It doesn't matter.
Just the
it's
Tristan
a
chord, yes, of course.
musicological argument.
Yeah, and of
that's
course
all.
I think the best name is the Tristan chord.
I mean, obviously, this is G sharp is an appoggiatura,
Sure.
which resolves to that.
yeah,
Now, this is the chord you have to name.
Yes, you can. You can.
And it can be named in A minor.
But
And
the
there is the
instant you name it,
dominant
it's
V minor.
changed. Yeah. That's one of the
That's what my
piece.
rival musicologists would say, and it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't matter.
It's just
Not
a
at
matter
all.
of
No.
nomenclature or orthography or
Yes,
whatever you want
yes.
to call it.
And that isn't what matters.
Anyway, we're talking about conductors and their
and Böhm,
influence.
yeah.
Now, Böhm has always had an influence on me on Mozart because he is, for me, the Mozart player. But that he, the possessor and prime mover of Tristan and Isolde, should come and say this just wiped me out. But the thing that wiped me out the most was that he was a young man. He never stopped talking, and he said, what's more, he was giving me a lecture, he said, die Übergänge von Tempo bis Tempo sind so richtig, dass jedes Tempo richtig sein muss.
Yeah, exactly.
Translate
Inevitable.
that one. Well, I mean, he said
It
the
means the transition
transitions
from tempo to tempo.
are so right that the tempos themselves have to be right, no matter how slow or fast you
Exactly,
play them.
yeah.
That was an incredible thing
fabulous.
to be told
What
because
yes.
that's the truth of,
Yes,
of
yeah.
tempo relationships.
And
Then
that
he
is-
came backstage, he talked to all the singers for ages, and he was there for hours. This young man,
Yes.
and glowing, and he asked me for my picture with the singer. I'm like a fan. I couldn't get over this. All I knew was the miracle. I don't care, Tristan, Schmistan, I know it was beautiful, but that it
Yes.
was, that I, through Wagner, was able to rejuvenate.
Revitalize
This
that man. Think.
And I had a letter from him you wouldn't
Yes,
believe
I
afterwards.
must see it.
Well, it's one of those stories.